Ladies and gentlemen, today we just got some massive news. Folks, as it would seem, President Trump has just achieved complete and total victory over the Chinese Communist Party. Now, as you all know, when it comes to global trade, for years now, China has been the world's #1 most predatory and belligerent nation. In fact, really, their entire economic model has been built on parasitically preying on both the United States and Europe. But with all of that being said, now that President Trump is back in the White House, those days have come to an end. You see, as the trade negotiations continue with China, President Trump just posted some bombshell news on Truth Social that I think all of you are going to enjoy. So folks, make sure to stick around for today's entire video because today we have a lot to talk about. But okay, take a look at this. As President Trump just said earlier this morning, I just completed a very productive call with President Xi of China. We made progress on many very important issues, including trade, fentanyl, and the need to bring the war between Russia and Ukraine to an end, and the approval of the TikTok deal. I also agreed with President Xi that we would meet at the APEC summit in South Korea, that I would go to China in the early part of next year, and that President Xi would likewise come to the United States at an appropriate time. The call was a very good one. We will be speaking again by phone, appreciate the TikTok approval, and both look forward to meeting at APEC. And so folks, like I said, this is some absolutely massive news, so let's go ahead and break it down. For the last couple of months, President Trump has maintained a 10% reciprocal trade tariff on China, as well as a bonus flat 20% tariff because they've refused to crack down on all of the fentanyl-related precursor chemicals that have been flooding out of their country. And so folks, simply put, these 30% combined trade tariffs have pretty much been crippling China's economy. But on top of that, behind the scenes, President Trump has also been able to successfully put together a coalition of over 30 European nations to work alongside the United States of America to pressure China to stop buying Russian oil. Which, of course, is ultimately aimed at 1. Isolating Russia and shutting down the war in Ukraine, and 2. Further isolating China and putting them back in their place. But you know what? Take a listen to what President Trump himself had to say about all of that just yesterday afternoon.
Well, if they did sanctions as an example, or tariffs, or whatever you want to call it, if they did that on China, I think the war would maybe end because China is by far the biggest purchaser of oil from Russia. And I think they have other powers over Russia, too. I'm speaking with President Xi, as you know, on Friday, having to do with TikTok and also trade, and we're very close to deals on all of it. And my relationship with China is very good. You know, we have a trade deal with them. We had a very good meeting the other day. And it sounds like they've approved TikTok. And TikTok is a tremendous amount of money for the United States, so that was nice. But we'll see how that all works. But if Europe did something with respect to China, I think China would probably maybe force an end to the war.
And so, folks, in addition to all of President Trump's trade-related goals, shutting down the war in Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine, is one of President Trump's top priorities. But you know what? Now, what do you say we really break down this entire TikTok deal? What this new TikTok deal does is transfer 80% of TikTok's US-based operations to a consortium of American-owned companies, meaning that the CCP pretty much loses all of their control over the app. And the reason why this is so important is because, as many of you know, the CCP has been deliberately and intentionally using TikTok as a means with which to inject radical far-left propaganda directly into the minds of young impressionable Americans. Seriously, on the Chinese version of TikTok, their algorithm pushes Chinese nationalism and traditional values, whereas the American version of TikTok, the CCP has created a special algorithm to push far-left insanity as a means of psychological warfare. So folks, what all of that means is that really this brand new TikTok deal that President Trump just negotiated with China is ultimately an absolutely massive victory for the United States. But now, there's actually yet another massive victory that President Trump has recently secured against the CCP that I want to talk about with all of you folks. But first, I do want to say real quick that if you guys enjoy the daily news updates, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a ton. But okay, check this out. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration officially banned Chinese nationals from purchasing American farmland, and they also imposed massive fines that are aimed at clawing back American farmland that is already owned by the Chinese. So pretty much, we are officially taking back our farmland from the Chinese Communist Party, and they're now officially banned from buying American farmland ever again. Because as you all know, the CCP has been strategically buying American farmland next to US military bases all across the country for years now. So finally, we are shutting that down. The fact that China was ever even able to buy this farmland in the first place is just absolutely ridiculous, but now those days have come to an end. But now, folks, there's also one more massive objective that President Trump has been working towards as it relates to China, and that is denuclearization. Take a look.
One of the things we're trying to do with Russia and with China is denuclearization. And it's very important. One of the things I discussed with President Putin the other day, it wasn't just that, it was also other things. And I think the denuclearization is it's a big aim, but Russia's willing to do it, and I think China's going to be willing to do it too. We can't let nuclear weapons proliferate. We have to stop nuclear weapons. The power is too great.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, we all know that that is the truth. You know, here's the reality. Whether it's convincing China to denuclearize or taking back all of our American farmland, or shutting down all of the fentanyl that's been flooding into the country, or putting an end to all of China's far-left propaganda on TikTok, President Trump is really perhaps the first leader that we've ever had that actually takes the Chinese threat seriously. The harsh reality is, China has been working to undermine and subvert the United States of America for decades now, and all of our incompetent leaders up to this point have just been totally asleep at the wheel, just letting it happen and turning a blind eye. And actually, when you stop and think about it, the Chinese threat is very clearly one of President Trump's top concerns. Think about it real quick. Why is President Trump trying to retake the Panama Canal? Because of China. Why does President Trump want Greenland? Well, because of China. Where is all of the fentanyl originally coming from? China. Who's been stealing all of our intellectual property and spying in American universities and American military bases? China. Who's been ripping off the American economy for decades now? China. So you get my point. China is very clearly a hostile, adversarial nation to the United States of America, and President Trump is fully aware. And so, folks, let the record show, as President Trump continues to grapple with China and rack up victory after victory, make no mistake, this is what it looks like to finally put America first.